At exactly 11 in the morning, under a white sun that made the courthouse steps shine like glass, Arman Qureshi stood with a wedding ring in his pocket, a custody letter trembling in his hand, and the terrible knowledge that by sunset tomorrow, he might lose the only child who still believed he was worth loving. He had not slept. His shirt was wrinkled, his eyes were red, and when he turned to the quiet woman beside him, the one who had once cleaned his office after everyone else went home, his voice broke in a way pride could not hide. "I need a wife by tomorrow," he said. And Sapphira Vale, who had every reason to walk away from broken men and desperate promises, looked at him with tears held tightly behind her eyes and whispered, "Then you need to promise me these things. If you believe in kindness, second chances, and the quiet people who change lives without asking for applause, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to Silent Dad Stories. Your support helps more heart-touching stories reach the people who need them most." Arman had once been the kind of man people envied from a distance. He owned a small furniture workshop on the edge of the city, drove a polished black sedan, and lived in a house with cream walls, tall windows, and a garden his late wife, Meher, had filled with marigolds. But after Meher died in a sudden bus accident 2 years earlier, everything inside that house changed. The curtains stayed drawn. The garden dried into brown stems. The workshop fell behind on orders. And Arman, who had been a confident husband, became a silent father who did not know how to braid his daughter's hair, answer her night fears, or sit at the breakfast table without seeing an empty chair across from him. His daughter, Neva, was 6 years old and had Meher's bright eyes. She still left drawings on his pillow, still saved him the last piece of mango, still waited at the gate every afternoon hoping he would come home before daylight faded. But grief had made Arman slow, and debt had made him ashamed. He worked late. He forgot parent meetings. He sent Neva to school with mismatched socks and cold toast wrapped in tissue. None of it meant he loved her less. It only meant his love had become trapped under exhaustion, like sunlight behind locked shutters. The trouble began when Meher's older sister, Karena, visited one Sunday morning and found Neva eating cereal from a cracked bowl while Arman slept on the sofa in yesterday's clothes. Karena saw the unpaid bills, the dusty rooms, the school notice stuck to the fridge, and the sadness sitting everywhere like a second layer of furniture. She did not shout then. She simply lifted Neva into her arms, kissed her forehead, and told Arman that love was not enough if a child was growing up lonely. 2 weeks later, a custody petition arrived. The hearing was scheduled for Wednesday. Arman's lawyer, an old friend named Tavish, tried to soften the truth, but truth does not become softer when spoken kindly. The court wanted proof of stability. They wanted routine, care, emotional support, and a home that looked like a home again. Karena's attorney would argue that Arman was drowning and taking Neva with him. And one careless comment from Tavish became a knife in Arman's mind. Judges often looked more favorably on a household with support, especially when a young child had already lost her mother. That was why, on Tuesday morning, Arman found himself standing outside the courthouse beside Sapphira, the woman he had known for 8 quiet months and never truly seen until his world was collapsing. Sapphira was not glamorous in the way strangers noticed. She wore simple cotton dresses, kept her dark hair tied at the back of her neck, and moved through rooms gently, as if she knew how easily things could break. She had worked evenings cleaning the workshop office after losing her job at a textile store. Sometimes Arman had found little things changed after she left, invoices stacked neatly, Neva's forgotten crayon box placed on his desk, a cup washed and turned upside down to dry. Once, during a rainstorm, she had stayed late because Neva had been waiting alone, and when Arman returned, he found his daughter asleep with her head on Sapphira's lap while Sapphira told her a story about a moon that forgot how to shine. Sapphira had not agreed immediately. When Arman came to her that morning in panic, asking for a marriage on paper, a temporary arrangement, something to show the court that Neva would have care, she stared at him as though he had opened an old wound. She had once been engaged to a man who made promises like people toss coins into fountains carelessly, beautifully, without expecting to pay for them. She knew what it meant to be used as a solution instead of loved as a person. So when Arman said he needed a wife by tomorrow, she did not ask about money. She did not ask about the house. She asked for promises. He had to promise that Neva would never be made to feel like a burden. He had to promise that he would stop hiding inside work and grief. He had to promise that Sapphira would not become a decoration for the court and a ghost afterward. He had to promise honesty, respect, and a real place in the life he was asking her to help rebuild. And finally, with her voice shaking, she asked him to promise that if Neva ever loved her, he would not snatch that love away when the crisis ended. Arman wanted to answer quickly, but Sapphira raised her hand. The street was bright around them, traffic moving, vendors calling, people rushing through ordinary days while his life stood still. For the first time in 2 years, he realized someone was asking him not for a transaction, but for transformation. He looked at Sapphira and saw not a cleaner, not a favor, not an emergency escape, but a woman who had held his daughter when he was too broken to notice she needed holding. He nodded slowly, and the promise that came from him was not polished. It was cracked, but it was real. They married that afternoon in a small registry office with sunlight falling across the floor. There were no flowers, no music, no smiling relatives. Only Tavish as witness, an old clerk stamping papers, and Sapphira standing with steady hands while Arman signed his name beside hers. When the clerk announced them married, neither of them moved. Then Sapphira reached down and took Neva's little hand, because Neva had insisted on coming after school. Neva looked up and asked if this meant Sapphira would stay for breakfast. Sapphira's face softened so deeply that Arman had to look away. That evening, the house began to breathe again. Not magically, not like a movie where grief disappears under warm lighting, but in small human ways. Sapphira opened curtains. Neva carried dishes from the table. Arman found a broom and cleaned the hallway without being asked. They did not pretend to be a perfect family. They burned the first batch of rice. Neva cried because she missed her mother. Arman dropped a plate and stood frozen at the sound. Sapphira did not rush to fix every pain. She simply sat with them in it. She told Neva that loving someone new did not erase someone gone. She told Arman, without accusation, that a house could hold both memory and mourning. The next day, the hearing took place under the harsh glow of a courtroom where every private failure seemed suddenly public. Karenna sat across the room with a tight mouth and wet eyes. She was not a villain. She loved Neva fiercely, and that made her dangerous. Her lawyer showed photos of dusty rooms, school notices, unpaid fees. Arman listened as his worst days were arranged into evidence. His shame grew so heavy he could barely lift his head. Then Sapphira was asked to speak. She did not give a dramatic speech. She spoke plainly. She said Arman had been grieving, not neglectful by choice. She said Neva was loved, but love needed structure, and she had agreed to help build it only because Arman had agreed to change. She described breakfast that morning, Neva in a yellow dress, Arman packing her lunch with his own hands, a schedule pinned beside the fridge, the garden watered before school. She did not exaggerate. That was what made her words powerful. They sounded like truth. When the judge asked Arman why he should keep custody, he expected himself to say he was her father, that he loved her, that no one could replace him. Instead, he looked at Karenna and said something that silenced the room. He said she was right to worry. He said he had failed in ways grief could explain but not excuse. He said losing Meher had made him forget that Neva had lost her too. Then he promised, in front of the court, that he would accept help, attend counseling, reduce his workload, and become present not someday, but now. The judge did not dismiss Karenna's concerns, but she did not take Neva away. She ordered regular welfare checks, school reports, and shared family visitation with Karenna. It was not a victory parade. It was a chance. And as they stepped out into the noon sun, Neva ran into Arman's arms so hard he stumbled backward. Karenna watched them from a distance, crying silently, and Sapphira did something Arman did not expect. She walked to Karenna and hugged her. Not as a rival. Not as the woman who had won. As someone who understood that love sometimes attacks because it is terrified. The months that followed were not easy, and that was what made them real. Arman still woke at night reaching for a wife who was gone. Sapphira still sometimes stood alone in the kitchen, wondering whether she had married a man or a storm. Neva tested boundaries, cried for Meher, clung to Sapphira, then pushed her away the next day out of guilt. But slowly, daytime returned to the house. Mornings became sacred. Arman learned to cook eggs without burning them. Sapphira revived the marigolds. Neva made a chart titled Our Brave Family and gave stars for things like Papa smiled and Sapphira told the moon story and nobody forgot my water bottle. One Saturday afternoon, while sunlight poured gold through the living room, Arman found Sapphira in the garden kneeling beside the flowers. Her hands were muddy, her sleeves rolled up, and Neva was laughing nearby with a watering can too big for her arms. Arman stood there quietly, watching the scene. Meher had once dreamed of a child safe in the sun, a home alive, love moving around without fear. Guilt struck him first, sharp and familiar. Then something gentler followed. Gratitude. Not the shallow kind people say politely, but the kind that bends a man inward and makes him humble. That day, he told Sapphira he was sorry. Not for needing help, but for first seeing her as help instead of as a heart. Sapphira did not answer immediately. She wiped soil from her palm and looked at him for a long time. Then she said the hardest promise was still ahead, he had to let himself live without believing happiness betrayed the dead. Arman broke then. Not loudly. Just a man sitting on the garden bench in daylight, covering his face while years of held-back pain finally found a way out. Sapphira sat beside him, not touching at first, then slowly placing her hand over his. Neva came and leaned against his knee. For the first time since Meher's funeral, Arman did not feel alone with his grief. By the end of the year, the marriage that began as a desperate answer had become a quiet question both of them were brave enough to keep asking, could this be real? Sapphira never tried to replace Meher. She kept Meher's photo in the hallway and placed fresh flowers beneath it every Friday. On Neva's birthday, she helped bake Meher's favorite almond cake and cried when Neva whispered that she wished both her mothers could have met. Arman heard it from the doorway and realized love was not a single candle. It was a lamp passed carefully from hand to hand, growing brighter when protected. Karenna changed too. At first she came for visits with suspicion folded into every glance. But Sapphira made tea, Arman listened instead of defending himself, and Neva began showing her school drawings filled with 3 adults standing around her like trees. One afternoon, Karenna apologized to Arman for trying to take Neva away. Arman shook his head and said she had done what love demanded when he had forgotten how to stand. That was the day the family stopped being divided by grief and started being joined by responsibility. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, share it with someone who believes broken families can heal, and subscribe to Silent Dad Stories for more emotional stories about love, sacrifice, and second chances. 2 years later, on another bright morning, Arman stood again in the garden, but this time he wore a clean white shirt and held a small velvet box. Neva, now 8, hid behind the marigolds with Karenna, trying not to giggle. Sapphira stepped outside carrying laundry, confused by the sudden silence. Arman walked toward her slowly. He told her that the first ring had been given in fear, under pressure, with a trembling hand and a desperate heart. But this one, he said, was being given in peace, in daylight, with nothing to prove to any court and everything to promise to her. Sapphira's eyes filled before he even opened the box. He asked her to marry him again, not because he needed a wife by tomorrow, but because he wanted her for every tomorrow after. The wind moved softly through the marigolds. Neva ran out too early and ruined the surprise, shouting that Sapphira should say yes because Papa had practiced the speech 14 times. Sapphira laughed through tears, and that laugh was the sound of a house finally forgiving itself. Special request: please comment second chances can save a family if you believe kindness can heal even the deepest wounds. Sapphira said yes, not with grand words, but by taking Arman's hand and placing it against her heart. And in that sunlit garden, where grief had once dried every flower, a little girl danced between the people who stayed. A father learned that love is not proven by never falling, but by rising differently, and a woman who had once been asked to become a wife by tomorrow became the reason every tomorrow felt worth living.